So we're going to talk today really about the start of almost every feature that you create, and there's a little bit of wiggle room with that. But sketches generally are definitely the basis for almost everything that you do. Now, what I really tried to do today was pick the best stuff, because obviously I could probably talk about sketching for an entire day. So I want to try and give you some of the most powerful things I know about sketching, and even some of the most basic things that you may not know. You've probably heard me say this a million times already. You don't know what you don't know. So in a presentation like this, we've got 22-year users, we've got 11-week users. You kind of got to show things as if you know nothing. And what you'll find out is that no matter how long you've been using the software, you're going to find something you didn't know about that you're probably going to implement. So hopefully that's where we go today with what you're going to see. Now, my credentials is I started in 1997, so February. It was the first week that SOLIDWORKS 97 was released. So I didn't see or work on, I have seen SOLIDWORKS 95 and 96. But when I started, there was only 3,000 users, and we're at about 3.1 million, I think, is the number that we officially have now. So the growth curve has been pretty significant, and also the functionality additional curve has been significant. And when you're a longtime user, one of the other rubs is that you can get into a rut. You can use the same things you've used year after year after year, and the only thing that changes is the color of the tool buttons, apparently, in 2016. But don't worry, 2017 is going to take that to a whole nother level. So download beta and check that out. But when you are using a software for that long, sometimes you lose track of the new functionality. And that's one of the things that we try to get out there and just make you aware of. So I've done a few things over the years with the Monomania stuff, and I've been married for a long time as well. Very proud of that. And my girls and my chickens. A lot of fun at my place. So it's a hoot. Quite a scene. This is sort of how I've got things laid out today. And like I said, I could have picked another 15 topics. So I want to start with the stuff that I think that you always need. Some interesting things about rectangle tools, spline tools, slot tools, different productivity functionalities when it comes to sketching. But then I want to get into some more productivity, how to quickly add dimensions, tricks about the dimensioning, and definitely relationships. Things changed the last 2 or 3 releases with how quickly you can actually add relations. And this is, again, where old habits will start to dictate old methods. So I want to show you some new ways that you may not be aware of with those. We'll talk a little bit about sketch options. Again, new things over the last 3 years where it ramps up the productivity of how quickly it is to make a sketch, add a dimension, and then move forward, as opposed to the very repetitive and linear steps that usually people do where they pick a plane, start a sketch, draw a sketch, dimension the sketch, and then use the sketch for something. We can scrub about half of that process out. One of my favorite tools here, convert entities. Anybody not ever use convert entities? Okay. I should have said it the other way so I could get you to raise your hands, but everybody uses convert entities. 2 years ago, 2015, sorry, 2 years ago, I'm prepping for 2017 now. Last release, 2015 for you guys, we added some things to convert entities that were long overdue, so we'll talk about that. Trim tools. I'll show you the trim tools. Honestly, I'm only going to show you one trim tool because even though there's 5, there's only one that I ever feel like I need to use, but I want to talk about those a little bit as well. And then just based on how time rolls out, I want to talk a little bit about 3D sketching and a trick that I have called a loop select. It's not a trick that I have, but it's something that I think you should know about, because when making sketches, you can duplicate entities, especially in a convert entities circumstance, but the way you select the things that you're going to duplicate can have a long-term effect, especially when feature change takes place. So that's what I want to get into on those. Splitting entities and why, even offsetting, which is really a lot like convert entities, only with a gap or an offset value, but some nifty things there. The segment tool, which was added in 2015, enhanced further in 2016, it's got some neat functionality with that. And then instant 2D. James and I were talking about this before we got started, but it's a behavior where you can quickly edit things inside of a 2D sketch, the same way that we added really a long time ago, 2008, something called Instant 3D, where you can change dimensions and feature values by pick and drag functionality. So I'll talk Instant 2D to show you what that is. Sketch Picture Scale tool, it's a quickie, but if you're in a situation where you import images and use those as the basis for either auto tracing or manually tracing things to make sketches, scaling that picture is the first trick that you need to get right. So we got a nice function for that. And then the last one here, I see this rarely used, but I see it rarely used because I find out people rarely know it's there. So I want to show you what an equation-driven sketch is all about and what you can take that through. So that's where we're going. So I want to get started here with the 2D sketch functionality, and then that's going to go ahead and start rolling us into the rest of the stuff here. So first thing I want to click on here is going to be some rectangle tools, and everything that I do is typically live in SolidWorks, so that's what you're going to see mostly today. But with rectangle tools, anytime you start a sketch, it's always the same process. You pick a plane, you start a sketch, and then you start dealing with some of the tools that are there. Now, the tools that we use, of course, are all these primitives. So a couple of different ways to draw a line. The key is, though, anytime you find an arrow here, a fly-out arrow, there's more than one way to do things. And that's pretty much with anything that you've got here. A few releases back, the rectangle tools underwent some enhancement. And what that enhancement was is, as you draw a rectangle, we have these options over here that allow you to add construction lines. And that used to be on just a couple of the rectangle types, but now no matter what type of rectangle you draw, you have construction entities. And you can choose either from the corners or from the midpoints. Now, I don't have a lot of use of drawing these from the corners, and the reason is because there's already an entity at that endpoint. These show you a nice center, but that's about all they give you. When you use them from the midpoints, what that'll give you is the center point, but it also gives you something here that you can latch onto. There's a little center point we can grab and drag, we can move this thing around, and it's just an easier thing to deal with as a result of that type of functionality. We'll start to show that a little bit later as we go. But no matter what type of rectangle you draw, you can use those functionalities. So even if it's more of a parallelogram or something that's going to be on an odd angle, you can click and insert those, and it will add those particular pieces of construction geometry. So be aware that those are available to you with any type. By turning those off, you're just going to get a basic rectangle in any orientation that is just the rectangle. Now, the center points lost a little bit of their need with SolidWorks 2016 because you started to be able to actually go ahead and grab midpoints directly. If I want to pick a midpoint, I can actually just pick on it. But I can't quite move it around the same way that I was moving around an actual physical point that's there. So be aware of that. Picking on that doesn't allow me to drag it around that very specifically. The other types of tools that I really like to talk about on these kinds of situations are things like slot tools. Slots were added a few releases back to really make the productivity of creating what is essentially two lines and two arcs that are either parallel lines and tangent arcs, or in the fact that you can do a radial type, an arced slot. That's now a couple of concentric arcs capped off by a couple of tangent circles, or arcs. This is a really simple tool to be able to utilize. So when you go ahead and select on a face and start a sketch, there's nothing mystical to that. But by grabbing on either of these slot tools allows you to do either straight or arced types of slots. Now, it's either a center point to center point start or a midpoint of the slot to a center point, which is the one that I'll do for starters here. So when we're looking at a slot like this, if you start at the midpoint and then go off to the side, you can snap this horizontal and vertical. And then once you click that into place and now pull, that's going to create the rest of that slot for you. It's a simple thing to be able to do, and it will auto dimension if you have the add dimension check mark turned on over here. Now, by doing this, you can also choose to have dimensions either go from center to center or to the maximums, the tangencies that are there. And this, as you can see, is a retroactive thing. If I set it to be the maximums and I draw another one over here, that's the setting I currently have turned on. So you'll see that that'll actually come into play on this initial creation. But even if I exit this tool and select that slot, I have the ability to retroactively change that dimension. So it's a nifty way to be able to do each of those. The arc slots, though, are just as cool. It's either a 3-point arc or a center point arc, so like you're drawing a circle or a 3-point arc, only you get the benefit of the slot after the fact. By starting with the center point arc, here I'll just start at the middle, begin by clicking the first point of the arc, second point of the arc, and then from there you're just pulling out and you're getting this really beautiful slot that gets created there. So this gives us an angle dimension, gives us a width dimension, and then in this case the radius itself. In any event, when I go ahead and take these and extrude them, and I'm just going to extrude these as a cut, don't really care how far they go, so we'll just pull them all the way through, you end up getting additional geometry that you didn't get when you drew two lines and two arcs tangent to each other. If you go ahead and actually show these things called a temporary axis, what you would get here is actually a temporary axis in the center of both circles, but also one right in the center of the arc. And the key to that was before we could do a slot mate, you had to be able to have something to mate a pin or some fastener to in the middle of the arc, and that temporary axis really was the magic to that. Even happens down here on the radius one. It's a very tiny looking temporary axis, but it is right in the middle of that slot. So that's a suitable thing to be able to go ahead and mate things to. The spline tools that I like to show, though, these are the ones that really allow us to create some very odd geometry. And there's 2D reasons for this, and then 3D reasons for the spline, which are going to be more like wires and hoses and things like that. When I'm drawing a spline, though, we've added recently a new spline type called a style spline. And that's really my favorite one here. Now this is an image that we've imported. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. But when the image is of poor quality, I have to manually trace these edges. We do have an auto trace functionality, but on JPEGs, you might as well give up on it because they have artifacts around the edge due to their nature. So typically what I'll do in this situation is I'll just create a sketch. And with that sketch, I'll draw a spline. Now, if I want to go ahead and map an edge, which I'm going to go ahead and map this really curvy edge in the front here, you can use the traditional spline, but I've gone away from that since SOLIDWORKS 2014. This regular spline is a bunch of points that you'd click, and then the spline itself would interpolate through each of those. The quality of this spline, though, is not very good. It's more like an Adobe Illustrator spline for anybody who have done vector graphics in that respect, where you have all these points that you can then change the weighting through those points and the angle of attack. And it can be independent on both sides, and it can also have a really big detriment to the quality of this curve. When you right-click on any spline, you have an option to show something called curvature combs, which is sort of an interrogation tool that shows you just how a curve turns from convex to concave, but also how quickly these inflections take place. And when you get these really funky and drastic changes that are adjacent to each other, that's really bad for the quality of that curve. So what we've added is something called the style spline, which from a user experience is a much easier thing to create. It's based on a bunch of construction lines, and then the spline itself sort of is weighted by the points that are on the construction line. Also in 2016, we added the capability to make this a B-spline, which is a really smooth curve. No matter how sharp it turns, it keeps the curvature very consistent and smooth. It's just an important thing. And you can look up on Wikipedia what the difference between Bezier and B-spline is. But that's what it is. It's a higher order of curvature, but still keeping it tremendously smooth. So when I go ahead and create something here using the style spline, what I end up with here is a bunch of clicks that are going to be basic linear inputs. So as I'm clicking here, I'm drawing construction geometry, and we're getting a curve that sort of follows what I'm doing. Now as a result of that, I have some capabilities to change this just through pick and pull, but the curve itself is being driven by where these points are, so it keeps it nice and consistent without all these really sharp inflections because I grabbed a point and twisted it in a really weird direction. And it's just a matter of doing a little trial and error, which after you do this a little bit doesn't take a whole long, but you can easily go ahead and map that curvature to something that looks really nice. And when we right click on that spline and show the curvature combs, what we basically get are these combs that are very consistent side to side, and they change from start to finish, but they're going to be a pretty smooth mix throughout on this feature. So that gives us some really nice geometry. Now another little side benefit here. I didn't explain this up front, but as a little demo magic, what we had going on here is I've got a surface that's actually a swept surface. And initially I had it created going between a spline and some non-existent geometry over here because this sketch actually was just a center line. We have a function that we added a while back that allows us to actually replace one entity with another. So if I was to draw a garbage spline and use that for a sweep path, for example, I could go in and edit that spline, draw another one that was completely clean, and then swap the one out for the other so that all downstream relationships would update to the new sketched entity, even though the old sketched entity was essentially being replaced and deleted. And it's called replace entity. So in the initial surface that I've got here, this line here was the left-hand rail of that surface. Well, I'm going to swap it out for this spline that I've just drawn. And I do that by selecting on the line, and there's a button up here called Replace Entity. So though that was now the sketch profile in a sweep, what I'm now going to do is say replace it for this spline. And what I'm going to do is delete the original, which could also be left by making it construction. But I'm essentially replacing it with this new splined entity. So when I do that, it now updates all downstream references to this new spline. So as I start to rebuild and go throughout my tree, what I'll now get is a full surface that updates to that new spline as opposed to the old line that was there. A little hard to explain here, but we added that in 2014 where if you do those types of swap outs, there was a lot of references and broken features downstream in the tree because they were looking for this old sketch entity that was deleted and replaced for a good enough purpose. But in this case, replace entity allows us to swap it out and everything updates fluidly after that. All right, we'll start getting into some really cool stuff here shortly. So dimensions and relations is really how you can take your sketches and this is the minutia. You have to put dimensions on everything. And you can work with underdefined geometry, of course, but proper practice would be to fully define your sketches so that the updates are predictable. But what I want to do is show a couple of things with dimensioning. When it comes to just basic workflow, dimensioning the center lines, for example, and then even dimensioning to a couple of circles or individual circles on screen and how those things behave. So let me go ahead and start out first with, we'll get to this circle one here first. Couple here that I want to show. All right. So I'm going to start off with this body right here. And what we've got is a sketch that's got a lot of blue underdefined geometry. One of my favorite things to do whenever I set up a new computer with SolidWorks is I add a hotkey. And that hotkey is Alt-S. When I click on Alt-S, that's my relationship hide and show. If you don't use a hotkey for relationship hide and show, then you're either fighting through this complicated looking sketch because as you zoom and pan, you've got all these relationship icons to deal with, or you're constantly going up to the hide show tools and showing and hiding relationships, which I don't even know which button it is up here just because I don't even bother using it up there. It's one of these guys. So hide and show relations is going to be, good Lord, that's points. See, I don't even use that. Use the hotkey. So I'm showing them right now. But basically, if you go to your view pull down menu, that's where you're going to get your modifier, your hide show. So Alt-S is what I'm using for that one. But it's quick enough to be able to use them because I like them, but I only like them a very small amount of the time because they do clutter your display. So Alt-S will get rid of that for just a second. I want to show some of the things that were added a while ago that really, again, can kind of be swept under the rug if you're not looking at those. I'm sorry? It's Alt-S for me, but I created that hotkey. So what you want to do is just go to Tools and Customize, hit Keyboard on the tab, and then find Sketch Relations and just do an Alt-S. Make it whatever you'd like. If you have a 3D mouse, using one of the buttons on your 3D mouse is also effective if it's a constant function that you do. So I want to illustrate a couple of things that have happened somewhat recently here, and this is 2014 stuff. But I'm going to delete some entities to do this. One of the things that happened was the ability to rapidly add relationships without an excessive amount of picks. I'm going to use a tangent arc right now to cover up this area that I just deleted a couple of lines. And when you draw a tangent arc off the end of a line, it's going to be tangent from that point. Now this is gesture based, so if I was to pull this to the left or to the right, of course that tangency will work. But if I go back to that endpoint and pull it out this direction, it's still technically a tangency, but it's a tangency perpendicular to that vertex. Or if I go back and push it back this direction, you see the tangency go that way. So this is just all the way I'm moving my mouse to get this to happen. Of course, the second end of this is all predicated on where the other entity sits. So as you end a sketch at a point, what you're now served up with is immediate relationships. This is what's possible between what I just drew and what I drew it to. And when I click on tangent, it simply goes right to it. Yeah, thank you. Now, when I draw a line, it's the same kind of thing. If I draw a line from the middle of space to the endpoint of an existing line, that's going to give me the properties for that line, but also properties like perpendicular and parallel for the entity that I drew to. So I can immediately go to perpendicular on something like that. Now it even works for splines. This type of stuff is pretty typical. So if I draw it from here to here and then end the spline down here at the line, same kind of thing. Only splines don't give you just tangency, they also give you curvature continuity. So I could do this as a Class A blend between those entities, and then that's going to work out nicely there as well. Now this works even retroactively. So things that are already drawn, things over here like right there we don't have a perpendicularity, if I pick the endpoint between the two, we get the relationships appropriate for those two entities. You used to have to pick both lines to get this to happen. Now you just pick where they touch. Down here it's the same thing. You pick that point and I can choose tangency between the pre-existing line and arc, and it adds those relationships easily. So that's something that's been around for a little while. Dimensioning also, though, is something that sort of walks you through the process depending on how you dimension. A while back, this has now been probably 10 years, but when you dimension to a center line, the sketch having a construction line like a center line, there's this thought that it's most likely going to be an axis of revolution. It's not always, but most likely that's going to be the case. So when you dimension from any entity to a center line, we've always had this behavior where we'll give you the linear dimension, but instead of placing that text, if I move my cursor below that center line, it automatically doubles that dimension so that that value is proper once you make the 3D solid. And we did this because in design tables, people would have to deal with a half-size dimension for a full-size part if they're trying to automatically update a dimension on a part with a table. And we don't like that visual. So full-size dimension is important. Now once I add this first dimension as a diameter, what happens is my cursor makes it a persistent function. There's a little center line with a D next to it. And that essentially means that that center line is now an understood selection. So even if I was up here where I couldn't even see the center line, I could dimension to another entity like a line, and it would automatically pick that center line and give me the double value, as you can see as I zoom out. So it's going to keep that going until I decide that that's no longer the case. So I can do it here again, put another dimension in. Everything else I have is pretty much fully defined unless I go to a point. So let me just go ahead and click to a point, and you can see that happen there as well. Now the beauty of this is that it helps you until you don't need it anymore. So if I really don't want to deal with that, maybe I come in here and I instead go ahead and select this line, which will give me a double dimension. If I immediately just go to something else, like maybe to this point, what I'm going to get now is a dimension that just goes between those entities. So it will persistently pick the center line until you choose to pick something else, and then it'll let go of the center line and go discretely to what you've selected. So it's got a neat behavior that way. We added, with this release here, the ability to do that also to an angled line. So if I now pick on a line that's on an angle, now I've gone past that function, so I'm back to regular dimensioning. If I now go ahead and pick a center line here, we don't quite get that same doubling behavior. The problem is that when lines are parallel to each other, they never converge. But when lines are on an angle, there's no one side or the other. They will eventually cross, and then it will flip directions. Sorry about the hand puppets, the video's not going to get that. But however, if you want to double this dimension, you hold the shift key, and then that will double that value. So it'll work on an angle and give you the full value, but the shift key is required to make that happen. Now, but I click that and put that in, I now get that same cursor thing, only it shows the A next to it because we're talking an angle, not a diameter. So here, if I pick on another line on an angle, it's then going to persistently select that center line. We still need the shift to give us that doubling value, though. So it's just a quick way to get those dimensions in place and selected and located properly. So keep an eye on that. If I pick something else, right now, again, it's showing on an angle. If I pick on anything, it's going to give me a 90-degree angle. If I just want to pick on something else, it will let go of that center line and then default to what I've actually selected. So that's the way those things function. Now, I like to bring up one here quite often. It's one of my favorite things to show, and that is the dimensioning to a circle. Circles are one of those things where when you dimension to a circle, you want to pick the circle. You get a lot of people come from 2D AutoCAD, and they like to pick points. In fact, when you draw a dimension on a line, you have to dimension from the end point to the end point, which I always thought was ridiculous. Just pick the line and let the software pick the end points. But when it comes to circles, circles have a whole different behavior. If I start picking center point to center point, what I'm getting is actual center point to center point values. And as far as the software is concerned, that's just a line. It's just points. What happens with this is you look at the properties for this dimension, and you really just have basic linear dimension properties. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here when it comes to this other tab in a second. When you dimension instead to a circle, let me delete that dimension, and go from one circle to another, it's always going to default to the center point of that circle. It's always how we've done it. However, what you get when you dimension from a circle to a circle is under the other tab, under the leaders tab, down at the bottom you get this thing called arc condition. By picking on the circle, you can now go from the center to center defaults to say maybe the minimums to each other or the minimum to the maximum on another. It's a tangency thing that takes place. And unless you dimension to a circle, you don't get circle or arc conditions. So it just makes sense there. Now with something like this, you can actually do that with the dimension when you're applying the dimension itself. And I've drawn these two pieces of construction geometry because this basically happens within a 90-degree window, 45 degrees on both sides of the center line to center line of this part. When I'm putting a dimension on, if I hold the shift key down while I'm doing this to an arc, I can essentially scrub into these little zones to get a dimension that's going to be either minimum, center, or maximum as I draw it. So let me do this. I'm going to hold down shift. And let's just say I'm going to pick this circle, but I'm going to pick it in this little window here that's sort of on the back edge of it. So it's about a 90-degree window, 45 on both sides of the center line. Now you're not going to see much of a preview here because I don't have the second part of the dimension on, but while still holding down shift, look what I get here on my preview. It's maximum on the side that I picked within that little window, and now it's on the minimum edge while I'm between these two 45-degree lines. Now as I hold my shift key down and move the dimension around, you'll see that once I get outside that window, it's going to default now to the center, and then if I get to basically that same bubble on the back side, it will then default to the maximum. And this is just by holding down the shift key as we add the dimension. Now when all is said and done, if I add this dimension and then place it, okay, that's wonderful, but I still have a dimension that's got these leader settings. They just happen to default to max max instead of center center, and then have me tweak it after the fact. So you can do this all day long. Hold down shift, pick within the middle bubble, and you'll have a dimension between the middles. And if you want to pick between the center bubble and the outside bubble, then I'm going to get one that's center to maximum. It's just a matter of where you pick when you've got that shift key down. But it's this magic little window that happens, 90 degrees here, then 90 degrees here, then 90 degrees on the back side, and you'll get those different nuances. So that one there I think is worth showing any chance that I get to when it comes down to that. So any questions so far, guys? All right, got to keep you awake. When you have pulled pork like that, you tend to doze off very quickly, and I didn't eat, so that's why I'm going to stay going here. So there's a couple of options that I like to deal with on sketching. And these are going to be global system options, not document specific. So it will be the way your system works every single time that we do this. So let me just jump right into each of these. When you go to Tools and Options, or the little gear icon up here at the top as it's been for a little while, there's a specific group of settings just for 2D sketching. Whenever I go ahead and pull this up, there's a couple that whenever I install a seat, again, there are default settings and then there are my favorite settings. And unless you're using an options file, I like to set these discreetly because I like to see if they've changed. But there's a couple that I like to show people just for your own sake. Now, solid edge users, you used to pick a face, start a sketch, and it will roll normal to you. That's this first setting right here. And we haven't had it for very long. We've only had it for maybe 4 years. But it's called Auto Rotate View Normal on a sketch plane when a sketch is created. Now, when you turn something like that on, what you basically get is that no matter what orientation I'm looking at something, let's just take this part for example. If I go ahead and pick this face and start a new sketch, boom, comes right to my orientation. And then I go ahead and I draw a circle, and then I hit extrude. Now it will jump back to the orientation that I started in. And then I can do whatever I want to. So if you like to work plan view, it will go between 3D to plan view and then go back to your 3D view when you're ready to do the 3D operation. But it's all based on that one setting. Tools and Options, Document Properties, Tools, Options, System Options, and then down to Sketch. It's the first one. Auto Rotate View Normal to Sketch Plane on Sketch Creation.
Think about that. I wish it had was good what you just did there. When you go back and edit your profile,
Yeah.
it doesn't come back up.
No, it doesn't. So it's not upon edit. So here we are looking at this one. If I pick it now and say Edit Sketch,
It does not come back up.
it's only on sketch creation. I think that's the terminology that was picked very specifically. Sometimes when you have limitations, as long as you describe it, you set the expectations. But that's not a bad idea. I would like maybe a sub option that says, also do this when you edit. You know, so not a bad idea. I don't have a notepad here, otherwise I'd take that. I'll try and put one of those in. Enhancement requests are the lifeblood of the software, by the way. And it's little comments like that that get that stuff put into the software. So those are good things to know. Down here is another one, though, that I get a lot of reaction to, and that's this Enable On-Screen Numeric Input on Entity Creation. This has been around for a while, but the one beneath it really is the one that made this usable, and it's called Create a Dimension Only when a value is entered. Typically, it looks like this. They are turned off by default. So if you go ahead and turn this on, I'm going to show you first behavior here, which is Enable On-Screen Numeric Input on Entity Creation. So that's how I'm going to set this. I'm going to pull up a different part here, just so that I'm keeping things consistent with what I've prepared. Not that bearing. What do I want to do on that one? There's another file I want to use for that, but I can go ahead and use any one of these different individual ones. No big deal. When you draw something, we want to avoid the dance of drawing your sketch, then dimensioning your sketch, and maybe make it a little bit more of a quicker process by allowing you to add dimensions while you sketch. So the setting that I have turned on is Add Dimension. When you draw a line, what you'll also see sometimes over here on the side here is some add dimension operations right here as well. Now with those turned on, as I draw this line, you're going to see my preview. As I click, it's adding dimensions. Okay, every single time I put that in. Now this was the initial creation of this tool. I think it was around 2012. And what we found out is that people spent more time deleting the dimensions they didn't want as a result of this than getting the benefit of the added dimensions automatically. So that's where things really got ugly with this one. Now the next setting is what made this palatable. So again, Tools and Options, System Options, and down to Sketch. That's Enable On-Screen Numeric Input for Entity Creation, but also Create a Dimension only when a value is entered. So this is what this one looks like. When I'm drawing a line now, I'm doing the click, click, click method. The AutoCAD method is how I refer to this because Windows is more pick and drag, so pick, drag, release. I'm just going to click and release and move my mouse. Now what happens here is you see a preview. If I type in a number now, it's going to add that value, and it's going to continue sketching. And I can type in another one here. Let's make that one 3, and then I'm going to continue in this direction. Now if I click and don't add a dimension, it doesn't add a dimension. So maybe you don't know a couple of these dimensions, and that's okay. But when you do know a dimension, go ahead and add it, and it will add that value for you. So maybe you know some of these, maybe you don't know some of them. It gives you the flexibility to type in a number when you know it, and don't type in a number when you don't. Now, one of the reasons I would show something like this is, especially when I draw circles. Circles are the ones that make this thing the most pleasant. If I want to get into a circumstance here where I want to go ahead and draw this bolt hole circle that you're seeing over here, I'm going to draw that bolt hole circle. But what I'm going to do is pick the face, I'm going to start the sketch, I did turn that setting on, and I'm going to take my circle tool, and without doing a pick and drag, I'm just going to click and move my cursor. And you see the preview, I'm about 375 millimeters on this one. If I type 400 right now, it will add the dimension, fully define the sketch entity because I put the center point on the origin, and now I'm on the way of moving on to something else. Instead of deselecting the circle tool, picking the dimension tool, adding the dimension, and moving on. So every sketch operation could be 4 button picks less, which is thousands of dimensions a week if you look at it. So just draw things in like that. If you pick and drag or pick, and you don't add a dimension, you don't get it. But if you do add a dimension, even while I'm picking and dragging, if I type 225 with my other hand, it will add that dimension for me as I'm typing. So it only adds a value when you physically enter a dimension. So it's a nifty way to get there a little bit quicker. Let's see where we're at on that one. Some of the other ones there, I just kind of leave those as default. But those are the two that were really ones that I thought were the most important to at least demystify. One that we added though, and this is one that I just accept as automatic, but we'll talk about that right here, is under this tool option and sketch system option. It's this one here called Scale Sketch on First Dimension Creation. Everybody know this one? We added this and I just accepted it as this is the way it's always going to be. So frankly, I just noticed that that was an option, but I don't see a reason to turn it off. But it's one of my favorite things because when you're drawing something, you don't have to be conscious of the size that you're drawing it. You just have to worry about shape. So as I'm drawing something, whenever I get into it, I'm going to make a feature of a particular size, but right now I'm going to be very, very fluid as to how I generate something. Draw it, I don't care how big it is. I just want to make sure that these things are of a relative size to each other, right? So those are the kind of things that you end up dealing with. Oh, my auto dimension is going to screw me on this one, by the way. That's what we were talking about just a while ago, John, or James. Sorry, I keep calling you John. Instant 2D, when you tap that dimension, is when it goes ahead and it changes the value. If you can double click it without moving, see, I have trouble doing it. Then you can get the modify box to pop up. That's the resolution on that is way too touchy. It is way too touchy. So yeah, so we're trying to work on that one. What I was trying to do though was actually not have any dimensions applied to this because that's probably going to screw up what I'm about to do. But you want to make sure that you just draw the shape relative to what you're working on. As we go ahead and add this first dimension to it, what we see here is that I'm at 10 point whatever inches. If I want that to be 2 inches, once I go ahead and type that 2, the whole sketch gets smaller as a result of that. Not just the one-dimensioned entity, which is how it would have been before. And if you're thinking about that, when that happens and it's a drastic difference in number, the whole sketch can flip. Arc tangencies can flip. It really gets trippy when you look at those. So by drawing it this way, I drew it 5 times the size, but that first dimension took it all and proportionally scaled it up or down. I think even if I do a zoom to fit, in some cases it will zoom to fit as if it was the previous value before we rebuild this sketch. So that first dimension is an important piece of that whole puzzle there. So that last option I was looking at is scale dimension. This is on by default, so you won't have to change this if it's not something that you've already turned off.
Doesn't that only work the very first time?
Only the first dimension. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, in other words, if you do that and you say, oh, I got this wrong, you erase it out and do it again, it doesn't work.
It worked on what I just did, which it auto-dimensioned this slot, and then I deleted those dimensions and then drew them back in. So it seems to be now the first dimension that's on the sketch, not necessarily the first one added. So if you delete all the dimensions and redo it, it looked like it worked. Although, I'm going to try something here because now I want to make sure that that is actually the case. What if I took this guy and, oops, we hit all the dimensions. Didn't want to do that. I was thinking of deleting all these dimensions and then redrawing one of these values. So this might take longer than I want to. I'm going to try this one offline. I think that's going to work now if you delete all those dimensions and then add a new dimension. The whole thing will rescale, but I'm not 100% certain of that. I'll come back and try that afterwards. Convert entities is by far one of my favorite, you can come in, Andrew, one of my favorite sketch entities. Convert entities is a super powerful tool. Allows you to duplicate edges, automatically link them, and then move on with a really super powerful thing. What it's always had a flaw with, though, is the way you select internal loops. And that's something that 2016 added some new stuff to. So I want to show you a little bit about that, as well as just the basic nuances for those of you who may not know what convert entities actually does. So I'm going to open up this file first of all. Let's grab this big guy. There's two that I'm going to do on this one. One of them is going to be out of slide order, but maybe I'll come back to this file when I'm actually ready to do that. Convert entities is one of these tools that allows you to duplicate edges. So here in an assembly, what I'm going to do is create a gasket that's the same shape as the face of a pump housing that's here. So I've got a part that's already started. So for effect here, I'm just editing a part that's currently blank. But I'm going to start a new sketch on the face of this existing part. Again, that'll rotate me perpendicular to that. When you pick a face and you hit Convert Entities, the flaw in this tool is always that it's always picked the outside edges. So even in this case, what I got was a sketch, and even if I show this as wireframe, it's not really going to give us a good effect. But it shows just the outside edges. Internal loops were never taken into account. Now the trick on this one, and I'll talk more loop select in a couple more topics, if you pick the face and then control select any edge of the inside loop, that, under a Convert Entities, would convert that internal edge. This one's giving me a duplicate error, but that's okay. Now that's a way to force it to the inside. The problem is multiple internal loops, which we have 4 of here. Not quite as bad as what could be, but in this case it's just multiple for the sake of showing multiple. The key to getting this tool to work this way is to press Convert Entities first. Bring up a little bit of user interface for this. What happens now is that as you select the face, you'll see the face selection, which will then default to the outside profile of that face. But this button here called Select All Inner Loops is the magic to this one. Now that means 4 or 40, it doesn't matter. When you click it, it's going to go ahead now and give us those 4 internal looped edges. So the 3 are the circles as opposed to just the outside. But what that gives us now is all the nested loops. So now when I extrude this, I've got both internal and external loops. Let's grab that contour, there we go. And then that's what we end up with. So it allows us to create those relationships, the on-edge relationship, and then it also allows us to very easily go ahead and grab the internal and external profiles. What this does, for those of you who don't know what Convert Entities will do, is if somebody makes a change to this pump and that face changes, this part will change right along with it. Okay, I'll talk more about that in a minute with loop select because I've got an even better example of that interpart relationship going on that one. Convert Entities is one of those things, though, that I like to show you exactly what's happening with this. Not everybody knows exactly what's taking place here. So let me just really quickly make some construction geometry. I got a couple of planes in space to which I'm going to make an axis between those planes. We will take that axis and one of those planes, and let's go ahead and just make a plane at an angle, because I like to show this with a plane that's sitting in there at a different direction. And 45 is plenty. Convert Entities is really just projecting things for us. So what I've got here is a plane, and this particular plane is on an angle. So we'll go ahead and throw this one up there. And I'm just going to pick this plane and start a sketch on it, because the way we have this set is it's going to move perpendicular to that location. If I grab an edge, say circular edge like this, and hit Convert Entities, what it's doing is it's projecting that edge over to the sketch plane we're working on. So when it's the same face, easily that's going to be the same geometry. But when you're looking at it at an angle, that's where the convert is just going to take what it sees from the sketch plane and converts it to the part. It's not taking this edge here and converting it to the sketch plane down here. It's taking it a 90-degree or perpendicular look at the sketch plane and what that edge appears to be as you're looking normal to the sketch plane itself. So any one of these really odd edges that we're grabbing and converting, they create crazy looking geometry, but it is because of the way they appear from that orientation. Okay, so that's the important part about that. Interfeature relationships are created, and if anybody ever goes back and edits the sketch, which creates a dimensional change here, which I'm going to use Instant 3D to modify, when we start to take that and make it larger or smaller, you can see that my sketch that's converted is moving right along with it. So that's the idea behind Convert Entities, is making sure that those features are cross-related to each other. Editing one edits both of them. But easy way to make that happen. That's an ugly looking example, but we'll go with it. The trim tools are something that are less and less necessary because of something we have called contour select. That's a little competitive thing that we did borrow from Autodesk Inventor, but they don't even do it very well. We borrowed it from them and made it better. So whatever, sorry. Got to say that. It's pretty clunky over there. But the trim tools allow you to make a nice closed profile. So when you're copying data from another feature, another part, 2D drawings, legacy stuff, it's easy to go ahead and clean them up to these nice closed profiles. So in SolidWorks, I'm going to close a few of these boxes. Keep an eye on my time here. So with the trim tools that I want to show you on this one, just in case time got out of hand, I did have a whole bunch here that I wanted to bring up sketches that are already there. What I have here is a very simple sketch. It's a couple of rectangles and a circle, and there's a lot of overlapping or intersecting contours. The trim tool itself has a bunch of different settings. There's these trimming to corners, things that are inside or outside of other clicked entities, and this thing called trim closest. But frankly, power trim is all you need to know. When you're power trimming, pick and drag with your cursor and you'll see this trail that follows your cursor. So when I let go, the trail stops. When I'm clicking and dragging, that trail is there. Whatever you pass across will trim. Now, it's a cool thing because it's not just a single trim off. There are doubles, there are internal types of trims. When I used CAD Key back at Western, which is now eons ago, we had to choose between 7 different trim options to trim off something, whether it was back to the closest or between two things or click, click, click. It was really clunky. Good timing for the vacuuming. So what we're going to do on this one is just pick and drag. So you see that as I drag it around and hover over something, it trims off that piece to whatever intersections are nearby. So here's a couple of single intersections. When you have a double, what it will do is the double intersection. So basically I'm just wiping across all of these. So I usually go very quickly. I just start taking things and I just start trimming off all the stuff I don't need just by wiping across them. And it's pretty easy to get all that internal stuff. Now by turning on my relations, one of the other things I want to show you here, and this is one of the reasons that Inventor does this very poorly, is that when we go ahead and trim off a circle, that's going to go back to duplicate intersections. And then I trim off this line. And look what happened to the line at the bottom. The line gets segmented, but when I'm done trimming, in the end what I have is 2 collinear lines. They're still related to each other. In Autodesk products, if you grab this line here and start moving it around, they are separate now. So it trims it and then disassociates things all together. Here my design intent is still intact, and I've got 2 lines that are relative to each other. So yeah, it's an interesting one on each of those. I've got a different sketch over here that I wanted to show a little bit of as well. There's just a few lines that are kind of crossing in space. The trim tool itself, when you click on trim and you're in this power tool, it's actually an extend tool also. There is a physical extend tool. If you click on that pull down menu, you will see extend as an option. But the trim works both ways. So if you're in the trim tool, you can either click the little pieces you don't need, wipe across them, easy enough to do each of those, or if you pick on something and release, you'll notice it's actually attached to my cursor now. And whatever I hover up to, it's going to automatically extend to. And then I can just wipe across the edge. So it is a click and release and click up to the part. Or if I want to undo that, undo a few things here that I want to do, I'm going to trim it one more time. You can also pick and drag up to that part. And then once you hover over it, you can let go and then pick and drag across it. So there's a few different ways to make this work. Even if they don't touch, I'm going to pick this one here and I'm going to drag it over to this one here. Look at that. Extends out into the middle of space where this one would be if you were to extend it. And then the same thing here. Now all that said, if you're putting a sketch fillet on something, which is something I wasn't going to talk about, but this does everything together. If I pick 2 of these lines and I click in there, it's going to automatically trim and extend those for us. So it gets rid of all that extra data and throws a little radius on the end of it too. So another way to deal with that. I'm not a big fan of sketch radiuses, but I like to put those in at the part level. What's that?
Amen.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Can't turn them off if they're part of the sketch. It's just as simple as that. But in the trim tools, by wiping across the pieces you don't need, you can make yourself some pretty simple closed contours just with this wipe operation. Don't even bother with these other ones because then you're picking things to trim in between and it just does it. Now if it's the last entity, it is a delete. Simple as that. End up with your last little arc here and then we have nothing to extrude. But that's how that tool functions. Simple trim and extend those around. I'm going to come back to this one here in just a second. Okay, so I got 18 more minutes. I'm going to cover the rest of this, and I'll get it out in quick enough time. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Can you merge sketch lines? We were talking about this the other day. I think it was just an add-on with Autodesk. We were able to.
So if I had a line here, and then I had another line like that, can I merge those?
Touching.
Not touching?
Oh, that too. That's fine.
Yeah, if I pick that endpoint and hit delete, that's one line now.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So even if it wasn't drawn that way, just picking that endpoint and deleting it. If they're perpendicular or at any angle to each other, that doesn't work.
Right.
It's only if they're together. I'll pick that and hit delete, and then it yells at me. But if they are collinear, then it will just turn it into a single line. So pretty cool.
Thank you.
I don't even know when they added that one, but it's one of those sleepers. All right. I'll talk briefly about 3D sketching. This one gets a little bit deeper into things. Who's making weldments and piping and hosing? You guys do that a ton, a little bit here and there. 3D sketching is fun because you can draw without the constraint of a 2D sketch plane. And there are ways to go in specific directions, but a lot of times this is made for making the stick work of work cell, anything that's going to be built with weldment profiles. But also many times, if you're not using the routing or hosing applications, you can get away with just doing a 3D spline that's tangent properly to different entities and then doing a sweep operation to make those happen. So when you get into any of these kind of operations, get out of that one a sec. I'll bring up a couple of quickies on this one. This is a 3D sketch. It's a 3D sketch that was drawn at one time, and it's drawn in all kinds of X, Y, and Z orientations. So to do something like that, you have your sketch tool that's up there, but it is a flyout as well. And underneath that, by default, you'll see 3D sketch as an option. Whenever you pick the 3D sketch tool, there will be fewer sketch entities because some of them just don't orient properly in 3D space. Some do need a 2D plane. But lines, circles, splines, even arcs in 3D space are pretty cool. When you grab your line tool, what you're going to see is something different. Right now we see X, Y. We don't see a plane that we're sketching on because I never selected a plane. There is an origin down there, but I'm just going to pick in blind space and start from there. Now when I move my cursor, projector's showing this okay. There's a plane coming out towards us, which is the XY plane. The tab key allows you to swap planes. Now I'm on my XZ plane. Tab again. Now I'm on the flat plane. So now I can draw to the left if I want. I want to go up, so I'm going to hit tab so I can do one of the vertical planes. I'm going to go ahead and come out the screen towards us, so let me just hit tab a couple of times till I'm in that direction. And all I've done in this case now is I've drawn something that now moves in 3 different directions. So here you can see it's going up, down, out, and then back towards us. So that's just a really basic example of what that's all about. If I grab my spline tools and I just start drawing splines in space, that spline happened to draw all on a flat plane because I never hit the tab key between it. But when you look at it and start grabbing the inflection points, now what you see is the change in X, Y, and Z direction with this little delta box that shows up. The delta box is important because in the early days of CAD, if you dragged something in an isometric position like a ½ an inch, you might have dragged it 500 meters behind it because of the way those bounding boxes were. In this case, you could drag a point, and that point could add a ½ a mile back to the back side, although we only do a kilometer in resolution, which is what Andrew's thinking over here, so that couldn't be possible. But this is now a spline that's more serpentining in 3D space. So one of the things I like to show with this is more of a top-down application for something like this. We end up with any type of hose that you might want to create inside of an assembly. So something like this particular situation here. So I've got a hose that I actually want to go ahead and modify, which I'm going to do right here. And it's this little hose that we haven't yet created. Now I'm going to activate a couple of 3D sketch points because by putting points into fittings, these are places that you can now snap to and select. Just makes life really, really simple with something like this. Now I'm working in the assembly, so the position of these parts will also update the final product that we've got here. But in the end, I just want to go ahead and do a 3D sketch in a part that I'm editing within the assembly. By using the spline tools, I can select the center of a fitting and some of these points that I have placed here. That just gives my spline orientation. If I click a couple of points here and then finish it in the center, those little click points there on those center lines just allow me to put that in a more predictable position. Now you see that my twist over here is pretty bad, but that's where I can go ahead and grab that point and drag it around on screen to get it a little bit more centered. Or if you want to, you can discreetly use some of the inputs over here on the side. And they do work. They're not going to give you great results, but that'll allow you to at least fine-tune this if you don't want to put a dimension on it. But once we have that hose in place, it's really just a matter now in 3D space of running a sweep. So there's my path. I can either use a sketch profile if I want to, or SOLIDWORKS 2016 allows me to skip the profile step and just say it's circular. Miss that spot where you don't have to have a plane and another sketch and a circle at a perpendicular angle. All of that stuff goes away. But then that's going to create a hose that's going to sit in this position. And again, the beauty of this is if I ever take this assembly and move it, this is not dynamic because a rebuild does take place. But once you move that and you rebuild, everything kind of jumps into the right spot. Fixed length splines are something that you can do in some of the newer releases or in the routing or hosing applications. But that's a reason to not have to be stuck on a 2D plane in order to go ahead and create something. Hoses being the poster child for that kind of thing. Yes?
I've heard more and more excuses as to why we can't do hoses because the data, the number of points, crashes everything because of
Yikes.
how complex these curves are, especially when you sweep them. Is that accurate, or can you dumb them down so they don't kill your model?
Well, I mean, a sweep is one of the more compute-intense things. So there's two really compute-intense features we do. One's called a loft, which is blending dissimilar shapes. The other is the sweep operation. Now, a sweep along a path like this shouldn't be devastating. A spring or a helicoil hose, something that's going to have a lot of turns to it, that's a lot more triangles than something like this. But the more organic the shape, the more triangles it's going to be. So that's sort of where it goes. For what you guys are doing here, do you think hoses are overkill? They can be. You get a lot more electrical going in here, and you get a panel, and now you've got...
It's not a matter of it being overkill from a design standpoint. It's a matter of you need 100 of them.
Yeah.
Because it's all the hard grease lines and the air lines and everything else. It's just so much that 3 of them in the model, I mean, but we have a hard time opening models without any hoses.
Yeah, quantities and stuff like that are going on. It's one of those, is it necessary? I mean, are people saying because they don't want to do it, or they just want the guys that are assembling to have to deal with it, or is it more trouble than it's worth up front to do it out on the shop floor? There's a few reasons for that.
Yeah, I can't always tell. I'd like to be able to put them in and then turn it into one entity without all the geometry, so that we
Yeah.
can tell the guys in the back where to put it, so it would get made consistently.
And that's why I like them to be there.
Nobody
Yeah.
does that, and it's left up to them, and 3 different builders build it for different.
Yeah, and you go out to service things on the field, and you end up with retrofitting things you can't predict. So, yeah. Freezing the parts, freezing the features. You're still going to have the video element of it to deal with, and round things swept are organic, and there's lots of triangles to make round things look round.
Moves that carriage there, that makes a different hose though, right?
It's rebuilding the hose. These two are from an old data set.
That's a different, it's not working like an actual part.
Correct. The last few releases, this is an old hose. This is from 1998. And then we didn't have fixed length splines. We only had it in our routing application even after that. As of a couple releases ago, though, you can do a fixed length spline, which in other words, what that would be is if I take this particular part and I've got my path that's here, which in this case is going to be my sweep underneath my hose. What I can do is I can add a dimension to this. So regular dimension tool, pick the spline itself, and what that actually gives you is a end-to-end length of that hose. So if I call this one 15, you see how my slack was taken up a little bit right there? What will happen now is that if that spline is dimensioned and I start to move this part, that part's going to move a lot more down there because it's got to take up the slack of that particular feature. So this one here is getting shorter and longer depending on the position of things, where the previous hose is not. You should see this kind of slack down a little bit more. Now it's staying 15 inches instead of being closest distance to a point or just sweeping the changes. This first hose here is not set to that. That's why it's kind of arbitrarily picking a place to rebuild. But yeah, that's a pretty old data set for that one. I'm going to pick and choose a couple of these here just so we can get through the rest of this. But Loop Select is one that I absolutely love to show here. Loop Select is one of those things where it really rolls nicely in the event of a change. And I'm going to illustrate this one actually by using one of my favorite little data sets that I've got from top-down modeling that we like to do. And top-down is referencing parts, but it just has a great effect in this situation. What I'm going to do here is build a towel bar that goes between these two parts. So I've already got the part started. The part is empty. But I'm going to start by sketching the part on this face. So here we're going to go ahead and put in a new sketch. Now I'm going to roll this off to the side here. And a lot of times what happens when you want to create an inter-part relationship is you'll pick the edge and you'll hit convert entities or offset entities, which I'm going to do on this one. What if I did that right now? Well, I've selected a discrete edge. I've picked an edge and I've said offset. So now what we have is a feature created from one selected edge. What I like to do is I like to pick the face and then control select this edge. I'm not actually selecting the edge now. I'm selecting the loop. And the loop is whatever the internal cutout is. Now I'm going to do this and say offset. We'll do this just so that we can create a towel bar that's a little smaller than what we've got here. Now, like a converted edge, this one shows as a black fully defined entity because it's offset a distance, but it's referencing existing geometry. Now the end conditions, and this is again top-down type design, is I don't just say arbitrary distance blind. What I like to do is things like up to or offset from surfaces. And when you do an up to surface and pick a face, it will go up to that topology and it will map that shape. So importing a headliner to a car, we can make the tooling, jigs, or fixtures for something like that. Now I can also go multiple directions. So we'll say direction 2, also, up to a surface, and in this case, a different surface in that direction. But in the end, what this is doing for me is it's creating an inter-part relationship. Now if we want to change the distance of this and maybe do paper towels instead of toilet paper, what happens is the end condition updates because the extrude is up to surface. So wherever that part sits, the end condition of the extrude changes. That's the first part of this. What really happens, though, is in the event of a drastic change to this particular piece. And I want to go ahead and tile my windows here so you can see this happen side by side. So over here, what's going to happen is I'm going to modify this particular shape. I'm going to hit it and say Edit Sketch. Now, something very drastic here. I'm not just going to edit the sketch. I'm going to delete the circle that we initially used for that and actually draw something completely different. And this is just to emphasize a point. Whenever you delete something, I've now deleted a reference. If I picked that edge and hit Convert Entities, that reference is now broken. But by picking the face and then Control picking the inside edge, what I'm defaulting it to is whatever this loop is. Now watch when I click back over in this window. See the towel bar updated? It's even 5-sided now. It is a hex now. So if I edit that sketch, you'll see it's actually a 5-sided offset entities, not just a circle offset entities. So 6-sided. Thanks, Andrew. That's why we got you here. Sorry. 5-sided plus the original. Now, whatever. So, but that's the relationship that you end up getting, is the loop versus the edges. Now, an example I typically show of that is a little bit more of a discrete situation, which is adding fillets to something. If I fillet these edges and I physically come in here and pick fillet and grab those edges, well, what happens is when we get a full change to this feature, what we now get is broken edges. So even in this case, if we add some 0.5-inch fillets on that, now we've got 4 picked edges. So when I come in here and edit this sketch and make it something else, doesn't matter what it is, but if I hack off an edge here and then go ahead and trim this up a little bit, what I've now got is a fillet that's only going to be on those original discretely selected edges. So what we want to do in a fillet like this is instead, we want to pick on the fillet, and I'm going to pick the face and that inside edge. Now what happens with that is we get it defaulting to that inside loop. See, even the outside edge didn't get selected there. I picked the face and the inside edge, and now only the inside loop gets filleted. And what happens with that now is if we go back and edit this particular sketch, and I'll emphasize the point here just by adding a couple of additional spots on this side, trim these guys all off. Now when I hit rebuild, the fillet likes it all. Okay? So that is defaulting to the inside loop, first of all, by picking a face and one inside edge, and that'll make it a loop. But it also makes sure that no matter what the inside loop is as a cut, it will always have all of those edges taken into account with the fillet. So it's a neat looking thing, and even if we edit that fillet, you see the input here is called loop, not edge or face or anything else. It is just whatever that internal loop happens to be.
Does it work the same way if you right-click on the internal edge and say select loop, or do you have to do face and edge?
That is a really interesting question on that. Right-click there, select internal loop. Not quite, because it's only what's adjacent to that particular face. Probably would work on this one then, yeah. Yeah. So right-click it. It's one of those mantras we always said too, if you ever have a question or want to change something, just right-click it. Chances it's probably there. So it's another one of those habit things, is I wasn't even aware that that was on that right-click menu because I do it a different way and have gotten into that type of a thing. Split entities. Why would you split entities? We'll start to ramp up the speed here a little bit. Split entities is something you do so that you get more predictable results. If I have a semicircle and a rectangle and I want to loft those, what can happen is because they have dissimilar vertices, they will loft, but they will not loft predictably. So what happens with something like this is you want to take this particular sketch. And instead of it being a line and an arc, we can use split entities. And anytime you click on something, when it's a line, it will make them multiple collinear lines. When it's an arc, it will simply make that in now to multiple arc sections, but they're all co-radial to each other. What that does, though, is it keeps the same geometry relatively, but it gives you more vertices, so that now when I loft a 4-vertex feature to a 4-vertex feature, I have full control over exactly how those faces are going to blend. So that gives us a lot more predictable results for those cases. So not always what you need, but that would be a reason to use a split entities. So offset entities, that's just what we did there. We took a sketch and we offset that particular feature, so we can blow past that just a little bit. But it's a great way to create an inter-feature relationship without having to re-sketch anything. 2016 allows us to pick on the dimension and actually flip that offset from the inside to the outside without deleting or re-sketching things. The segment tool is something we added in 2015 and have updated more in 2016. I use it all the time when I'm using the whole wizard, and that's probably the best place for it. The segment tool allows you to chop a sketch entity up, much like split entities, but it lets you chop it up into equal-sized bites. So anything that we happen to be doing on something like that is going to automatically give us the spacing between each of those features. So when I'm looking at a part like this one here, I'm going to draw a whole wizard hole on this end face. And the magic that we'll do on this one is that I'll draw a circle like I showed before. I'm going to draw it, but I'm going to type in my dimensions now because input dimension or import dimension on sketch creation is turned on. And then we'll just make that a construction line. The segment tool will take it and do two things. It will either allow us to pick an entity like a line or a circle and chop it up into equal sized sketch segments, which in this case would be co-radial arcs, or allows us to put sketch points coincident to that entity at equal spacing. So when I start to go ahead and change this, you'll see that we get 10 sketch points. 2016 made this smarter because now it's not only points, but they have a relationship called equidistant so that they maintain their spacing to each other. And if you come in here at any point and start deleting these points, the remaining ones will respace because they're all still equidistant to each other. So it's a really nifty way to do that. But for the hole wizard, it's perfect because generally what you want is equal spaced holes around something. So it'll put a bunch of points in there, and then the hole wizard will continue and finish up with the hole feature. So the segment tool is a pretty good one for those kinds of things. Instant 2D I will do rapidly right here because that's what it's all about is really quick ways to do things. When we're looking at a sketch like this one right here, what you end up with Instant 2D is quick editing. So I'm going to turn off my relations for a second. Instead of double clicking, changing a dimension, and then exiting or rebuilding, now you just tap a dimension one time, and when you type in a value and hit enter or click off of it, it will update immediately. But what makes this even more powerful, and it works in 3D also, is when you click on that dimension, what you also get are these handles that pop up, little grips. And you can drag those around and it will dynamically update your feature. But you can also snap to the scale that pops up so you can have an element of accuracy there as well. So it's dynamic drag and drop, but I could drag it directly to 20 without very much effort. So that's what Instant 3D is all about. When you click on a dimension that has open degrees of freedom in both directions, both endpoints will give you a handle. This one happens to be fixed to the origin, therefore I can't modify this side. I can only modify this side. But it allows us to drag those things around dynamically. Sketch Picture Scale tool, we'll skip that one real quick. Equation-driven sketches, last thing I want to show you. And if I have time, I'll go back to that other one. Equation-driven sketches are interesting, and I'm just going to show you a final example of this one. And if you need this example file, then I'd be glad to show it to you. But it's something where you physically draw in a curve based on more numerical inputs, so more arc, cosines, tangents, and the like. The feature that I'm going to actually use is this surface that creates this neck. And I've created a spline here that's a 3D equation-driven spline. Now it looks like just a regular arc because of the numbers that we're using, but when you go ahead and pick your spline tools, right there is your equation-driven curve, and that's how we got to this. When you pick on that spline, your property manager has different inputs. So down here is the equation. Now if I change the y input to this, and I'm going to change this value here to a 0.5, what this will do, I'll zoom in a little bit more before I make this effect. When I hit this, you'll see it'll now turn that curve into a sine wave. Now as a result of that, this happens to be an extruded surface, and then that surface is used to trim the rest of the part. So instead of the regular neck that we had on this milk jug, what we now end up with is a wavy neck on the milk jug. And that's all by drawing a curve based on an equation as opposed to trying to draw in several features and maybe pattern them to make this effect. But that's just a surface extruded off of a feature. I will go back and do the Sketch Picture Scale tool, and then I'm done. So when you need to bring in a picture, that picture has to have some sort of reference. And when you're in SolidWorks and you're editing a sketch, what you can do here is just simply click Sketch Picture. Now that'll make you navigate to wherever this thing happens to be. So let me just quickly get into this one, and we will open up this last feature. So the sketch picture on this one happens to be a PNG file with a little reference for a size here. When I bring it in though, this line down here is 6.5 inches. This one up here is proverbial 6.5 inches on the sketch. So what happens is this line shows up, this blue line. What you do is you position it on the picture. So I put this point here, I can put this point anywhere that I want it to be, say right down here. And when I click it in place, it now prompts me for a dimension. Type in what that length represents, and it will then scale the picture down to that exact size, which I can now go ahead and position it where I want. I can even grab this endpoint and rotate it around if I want to. And now I've got a sketched picture that's identical to the size I actually need to sketch at. So if you've got some sort of known value inside that picture, it's a really simple way to go ahead and scale it to the proper size. All right, so that's what we just went through in the last hour. Thanks for adding 15 minutes to this because I definitely need it. We're going to put this up on the website pretty quickly, and if you have any questions, there's my email address. Oh, it's not on there? Yes, it is. And then our Twitter and YouTube pages. So thank you very much for spending an hour with me. I appreciate it. Thanks.